I'm very pleased to introduce our last speaker tonight, our last Rhett Terrier talk. Professor Raymond Fisman is the Slater Family Professor in Behavioral Economics in the Department of Economics here at BU. He arrived in 2015 after teaching at Columbia, Harvard, and consulting at the World Bank. He has obtained major grants from the National Science Foundation, very hard to do, studying risk preference and the impact of intellectual property rights reforms on innovation. And he's currently the co-editor of the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organizations. So please welcome Professor Fisman.
Thanks so much for having me. I, in contrast to the first speaker, have no product to offer you or the world, but I hope I can offer you in the next 15 minutes a single insight that I hope is useful for thinking about the following sort of circumstance. So around the middle of 2008, there were a pair of newspaper stories that appeared strangely coincident with one another. First, there was a Boston Globe story about Boston firefighters. The story was broken when a firefighter on disability came 7th in a national bodybuilding competition. I have a picture of him to show you in a few minutes. And it turned out that essentially every Boston firefighter, upon retirement, started to pick up disability benefits. A few months later, we had a replay of exactly the same story for the Long Island Railroad workers. Now, if you can remember, if you were reading the newspaper at the time, you know that these two communities of workers were just raked over the coals for this. These were bad people. And I hope I give you, by the end of the next 15 minutes, a way to think about their situation, to appreciate that these are people in bad circumstances. They are not bad people. And if I were in their circumstances, I would surely do exactly the same. That is, what I want to help us understand is what I mean when I talk about a culture of corruption. Now, I'm not going to assail you with statistics. I'm going to do something much, much worse, which is I'm going to start off with 3 definitions, which will be essential to just so we're all on the same page of what we're talking about when we talk about culture, which is an incredibly loaded term. And when we talk about corruption, which means different things to different people. So first of all, the reason why this is in quotes, this is literally a dictionary definition, albeit from a dictionary of economics. Culture is generally shared social understanding resulting from commonly held assumptions and views of the world among members of a society. So how do I want you to think about this? It's beliefs about what constitutes right and wrong behavior, and beliefs about how we think others will behave. Now, why do we care in economics about both of these things? Because we think it'll shape how we as individuals behave. My behavior is surely shaped by what I think is ethical and unethical. And similarly, and I'm going to really focus on the second part of this, what I do depends critically on what I expect others to do. I'll be much more specific about this in just a moment. So imagine that you go on a business trip to Japan, and you're from Italy, just to make it as extreme an illustration as possible, and you come to your counterpart at a Japanese firm, and you give them a big hug and kiss on each cheek. So that is a violation of cultural norms. It is not what is expected of people in Japan. So social relations work much more efficiently, much more fluidly, if we all have similar shared expectations that make this work more smoothly. Okay, so let's set aside culture for a moment. Corruption, well, the main thing I want to distinguish between is unethical behavior and corrupt behavior. So when I talk about corruption as the misuse of public office for private gain, I don't mean moral corruption. I mean lawmakers in Washington taking bribes. I mean lawmakers in Washington embezzling from the Treasury. Luckily, we live in a place where those things don't happen so often, but it's the misuse of a public office, a government official misusing his or her position for private gain. We put these two things together, what do we have? We have a culture of corruption. So note the two components that parallel the generic definition of corruption. So a culture of corruption is a belief that behaving corruptly is okay, that there's no moral sanction against bribe taking or embezzlement or cheating on your taxes, or skimming off the top if you're at the IRS. And furthermore, and these two things are reinforcing, the expectation that others behave in the same way. So if you think about yourself as being go through the following thought experiment. You're pulled over by the Massachusetts State Patrol on your way driving to Western Massachusetts. Do you offer a bribe? No, you do not. Because the expectation is that you pay the fine, and this is reciprocated by expectations on the other side of the transaction that a driver will pay a fine and will not offer up a bribe. And again, there's a lot of friction, a lot of time wasted on the side of the road, a lot of nights spent in prison, if there are not these shared understandings. Okay? This is going to be our basic building block for understanding two things. One, how otherwise similar groups of people, groups with comparable ethics, and possibly even comparable histories end up diverging. You didn't see the Chicago Railroad workers with disability rates comparable to the Long Island Railroad. You don't see firefighters in other parts of the country behaving the way they did in Boston. And this framework will also hopefully help us understand what to do about the problem. So I'm a development economist. I'm mostly interested in the big picture question, why are poor countries poor? Not just because we want to sit back and see them stay poor, but so we can take some action to do something about it. So I've given you some definitions, and now I am going to give you a combination of pictures and also animated graphs. So I want to start by saying, I don't want to say that values is just not part of the picture. Okay, so one illustration of there actually being these different beliefs about what constitutes appropriate behavior. And this was about my 30 seconds of fame that took place, sadly, long before any of you were reading and writing. I did a little study on diplomats in New York City that got far more attention than it deserved, which was built off of the observation as a New Yorker at the time that you see these cars with diplomatic plates doing all sorts of things that they just shouldn't. There are also stories about Russian diplomats starting fistfights with the cops and so on. How could they get away with this? Diplomatic immunity. Okay, so this is a case where you have diplomats coming from many cultures around the world to a place where they're freed, they are unshackled from any legal constraints, and they can behave as they wish. You see a starkly different response from countries that, on any standard measure, whether based on asking people how often do they pay bribes in these countries to surveys of experts, you see high rates of violations per diplomat when we're freed from legal constraints. We misuse our diplomatic office for personal gain via double parking. And then you see all the Scandinavian countries over here so you're unshackled from any legal constraints, and you've so internalized the rules that you don't break the law. If you look through these lists, you see there are some peculiar cases here. In the 7 minutes I have left, I can't give you details behind every data point, but there are some interesting stories there. Actually, just one quick digression. There was a long-running dispute between one Kuwaiti diplomat and a single member of the New York Police Department. He believed that this parking spot on the street outside his home was rightfully his, and he would park there every day. And the cop would come by 3 times a day and layer tickets on top of his car. So that's why Kuwait's up there. That's often asked. So we find this general cross-country correlation, but you can find these pockets of corruption everywhere, and I gave you 2 to open. So we want to try to understand how these pockets come to exist. In the little bit of time remaining, I'm going to go through a framework which was developed by Thomas Schelling, who's an eminent economist who won a Nobel Prize for this work some years back. I'm going to give you a very stripped down version of it that I hope helps you appreciate how we get these divergent results. So on the horizontal axis, we have, just think of a society and think about people just sitting on their own deciding, am I going to pay bribes or am I going to stay honest? I going to try to pay a bribe to get to the front of the queue, to get the government contract, etc. And on the vertical axis, we have the benefits of, first of all, staying honest. And I'm going to argue that the more people who behave corruptly, the fewer benefits you get from behaving honestly. You have more and more people cutting in front of you in line. And moreover, the more people who behave corruptly, the benefits from corruption relative to staying honest narrow and then flip. Okay, so why do the benefits increase as more and more people pay bribes, at least initially? Well, now you can find partners. And you don't constantly have people around you who you're worried are going to call you out for what you're doing. Why does it eventually decline? Well, initially you were able to bribe yourself to the front of the queue. Now you don't quite get to the front. The main point, though, is that if you think about someone at the vertical line who's thinking, I think I'm going to try to pay off the traffic cop instead of paying the ticket. In expectation, it's just not worth it. So as he goes through this thought exercise, this thought experiment, well, if I think this is the fraction of people who are corrupt, do I actually want to stay corrupt? No. So fewer and fewer, it's a virtuous cycle. Fewer and fewer people pay and receive bribes, and you get to the no bribe equilibrium. And once we're there, it's a stable point. There's no pressure to go in the other direction. So if you go flip to the other side of the point of intersection, it goes in the other direction. You think about someone who's thinking, well, I'm actually going to stay honest, but he sees everyone cutting in front of them to get to the front of the queue. They're not getting any government contracts, etc. We go in the other direction. So you get these two polar equilibria, these two stable points where either everyone's paying bribes or no one's paying bribes. You've got the Long Island Railroad workers or the Chicago Railroad workers. Okay, so the two stable points are the honest culture at one extreme and the corrupt culture at the other. Okay, so that's my very terse encapsulation of the problem. Now, my even terser description of the solution is that, boy, this is going to be really hard because we can't just change one person. We can't make one person more ethical at a time. Because imagine you make one person fear punishment or just change the way they think about corruption when we're at the far right. Well, we move a bit that way, but then there's this pressure pushing us back to where we were. So to change this sort of equilibrium, we kind of have to change everyone's expectations at once. So I want to first say that, yes, this is hard, and this is why we don't have many case studies of successful anti-corruption reforms in modern history. But I'm going to say a little bit about one that I think is just an amazing story, and it's in fact a story in progress. This is just a very simple equilibrium change where in Samoa about a decade ago they switched from driving on the right to driving on the left. This is a very simple, by comparison, shift in equilibrium. Because you have months of preparation, public announcements. You don't have anyone who's benefiting from staying on the right the way you have people benefiting from maintaining a corrupt system. And even then, there were all sorts of worries that this was going to be the Samoan apocalypse. It all turned out fine. So let me give you the greatest anti-corruption reformer in modern history. If you know who this man is, put up your hand like you're proud to yell it out loud. Who? This is Antonis Mockus, who was the two-time mayor of Bogota. This is Mockus during an unsuccessful run for president of Colombia. I should say, just particularly for this audience, how did he come to be mayor of Bogota? He was a university professor. He was the equivalent of Bob Brown at one of the universities in Bogota. He was kicked out of the university because he faced an unruly auditorium full of students and so frustrated that they wouldn't be quiet, so he just pulled down his pants and turned around, and there was silence. So this is a man who understands what makes his people tick, if you like. So he went from his fall from grace to running as a total outsider for mayor of the city. Now, you are all much too young to remember that the early 90s, which is when he had his run for mayor, was the post-Pablo Escobar years. And maybe you watch Narcos, so you have some sense of it. But like, there are bombs going off in the city every night. Highest murder rate per capita outside of a war zone in the world. And in comes super citizen Mockus. So if that isn't silly, he comes in with a 70% vote share, and that's actually important to note. If that isn't ridiculous enough, here is his first act as mayor. Who is that gentleman? He is a mime holding a pink sign that says incorrecto. So this is someone who is mocking lawbreakers. Okay, so after a little bit of mockery to try to shame people into behaving well, they started his second act as mayor was he handed out referee-style red cards. If you saw someone doing something bad, you could flash them a thumbs down. On the other side of the cards, this is a multi-purpose tool. You can flash them a thumbs up if they do something good. It's not the red thumb, it's the other thumb. Okay, so before you think, well, this is a little ridiculous and there must be something else going on, and it can't be that the murder rate fell by on the order of 80% within a couple of years of his taking office, let me say a couple of things that Mockus had going for him. So in contrast to private enforcement actions, this is a very visible way of saying things are changing here. It's not a private transaction. If you think about the thumbs, the extension of this, everyone now has the opportunity to signal, I'm a part of this movement. So if we're in a situation where what really governs our behavior is what we think others think and how we think others behave and what's expected of us, then this effort at, albeit sort of a little bit eccentric, this effort at changing norms, changing the way we think about our roles as citizens, maybe isn't so crazy. So what do I take away from the Mockus story? Well, it's not even enough just to change people's beliefs about what they think is right and wrong. They have to understand that they are part of a movement where everyone else is changing along with them. So while we don't have many success stories like that, hopefully you can take a few lessons from this with you. And the lesson is not traffic mimes are awesome. The lesson is the importance of culture. Any questions? Yes.
So how do we apply this to campaign finance reform?
Yeah, so
Washington, every time that they distribute checks on the floor.
no, so campaign finance is a very
It's not
different.
exactly corruption, but
Well, it is. So I'm going to quickly flip back to the definition of corruption as the inappropriate use or abuse of public office for private gain. I've deliberately avoided using any legal definition. Usually, our three benchmarks, legality, public opinion, and public harm, happen to line up if we've written the laws appropriately. In this case, we sort of think they have not. We do think about the problem differently because it's not a matter of enforcing laws that exist and changing norms that line up with laws that, as written, we actually have to change the laws. And I suspect that it's related to a problem that, it's related to this problem in that it is similar to, you go to India, people know that their legislators are corrupt. They vote for them anyway. So we know that the people we elect aren't going to change campaign finance. We elect them anyway. So, these changes, this is a much more than a 5-minute question, but these things tend to change when a party gains some momentum that makes this their issue. Like, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't really think so much about multi-dimensional platforms, and that's how they explain away much of this. I'm sure there's some truth to that. But the place that we're seeing change in India, for example, you have a one-issue party, or it's a party that's made it their one issue, and you have exactly this sort of equilibrium shift. In that case, driven by an external push, some number of members of the Indian diaspora who have become accustomed to a different set of norms who would like to move back. So it's a hard question. Yep.
So, sorry. It seems that the whole story is based on this model. How was this model obtained in the first place?
So the history of the model is Schelling actually used it to think about segregation. And his model of segregation, it applies to lots of settings where you get tipping in one direction or the other. And he was trying to explain why, if you ask anyone in an urban community, they would say they prefer not to live in a segregated neighborhood, but they also don't want to be in the minority. And if you think about the cost-benefit trade-off, once you have these two concerns about where you live, that'll generate this sort of tipping in either direction. So Schelling didn't develop this model to think about corruption, but we, meaning my friend Miriam Golden and I, are certainly not the ones to frame it in these terms. That's the origin of it. Thank you very much.